I'm a sucker for horror games, especially in first person. I look at the eShop, see a game of the genre with some cool environments and visuals, and I turn into John from the Garfield Christmas special and ooh, with interest. Sometimes I get something really cool like Infernium, and sometimes I get something else. That leads us to today's review. I saw this game on the coming soon section of the eShop, reached out to the publisher, and they responded with a press code. Here is my review of Syndrome for the Nintendo Switch. In Syndrome, you wake up from cryosleep in an abandoned spacecraft. With no recollection of what happened to the crew, you traverse around the ship to figure it all out, talking to two conflicting survivors and fighting off mutated abominations along the way. Now the story here I would call pretty okay. The first half of the game has this big and interesting mystery about it. You have no idea who you are and what happened to the crew. You have these two people telling you very different, conflicting things. It almost feels like you could go either way, and I wanted to know what would happen next. Unfortunately, the second half of the game is just okay. The truth reveal is very generic and not at all what I expected out of this mystery. It's interesting, but like the Disney Plus show WandaVision, the mystery build-up was a lot better than the actual reveal. Now when it comes to gameplay, this is a first-person horror game with puzzle, combat, and light stealth elements. As you trek through the game, you'll be exploring a dark and creepy spaceship while navigating around hazards and abominations of nature that stalk those halls. As far as main progression go, you navigate and explore the ship for each objective, between the actual decks and the elevator system that acts as a sort of hub between the different areas. Whether you need a key card to open a locked door or some C4 to sabotage part of the ship, you'll be wandering those halls and swapping levels for the entire game. The way this goes is pretty good. You only have access to part of one deck at first, and as you complete objectives and get more tools, it opens up a bit more and you gain entry to a lot of the hidden and blocked off areas. But enemies wander the halls, so you aren't just exploring. About an hour into the game, you're introduced to the monsters and combat. This is where the game's difficulty comes in, and that difficulty is pretty high. You gain tools and weapons like a pipe wrench for melee and a few different firearms. But all enemies are tanky and both ammo and food or health items are very scarce. It's clearly meant for you to feel vastly underpowered compared to the monsters, and while there is a bit of a weird and clunky way to do melee one-on-one with blocking, the game is pretty difficult. And that difficulty just goes higher through the fact that there's no checkpoint system. You have to do hard saves every time you want to save your progress. Opening up the menus or save points doesn't actually pause enemies, so if you've got enemies right on top of you and you need to eat or save, you gotta make some distance before you do so. And the menus themselves are really clunky and weird. You can only navigate them with the left analog stick, and they are pretty laggy. Though fighting isn't all you can do with enemies. They get more variations with different tactics as you progress farther into the game. You start with the slow ones that attack you with melee, but soon get to others that can one-hit KO you but can't hear you. This forces you to go for more stealthy tactics of avoiding them rather than fighting. Now beyond that, is this game scary? The dark ship environment and style of everything certainly evokes vibes of games like Doom 3. That's what initially piqued my interest in it. But it's like the story. At the start, you got a lot of really good sound cues that work well, and many of the jump scares also are pretty effective. But once you get so much of the same sound cues repeated again and again, the tension just wears off. The game definitely has good atmosphere, but really needed more variation in its scare tactics. Speaking of repeating things over and over, let's talk about backtracking. Most objectives in this game require you to go to a place, get an item, and take that item somewhere else. This is a fine way to get puzzles solved, but the game does it far too much. And by far too much, I mean it's literally the entire game. Especially in Acts 2 and 3, you need to get into this room for an objective, but it's locked, so go get a key from this room and come back. Oh, you got in, and now you need another key to use the turrets, so go back and backtrack more to get another key, come back here, and then use the turrets. It gets a little excessive with so much backtracking for each objective where you have to constantly backtrack multiple times just to get one thing done. That also gets us to content and length. For a horror game, the length is a bit lower than the standard. It took me around 6 to 7 hours to get through it with a decent amount of deaths and reloading. Next up is presentation. Visually, I think the game looks fine. It has a pretty strong blur, especially when trying to read signs around the environments, but it is serviceable. Especially when you consider that this game is optimized pretty well as far as performance go. Admittedly, the load times are very lengthy, but the frame rate is good. In docked mode, the game pretty much never drops below 30 FPS and will often climb much higher, though it does dip into the 20s often when playing in handheld mode. This game is also known for being extremely glitchy on other platforms, and there are some glitches here. There aren't really any game-breaking glitches outside of the occasional falling through the floor, though if I'm being honest, that only happened to me once throughout the entire game. Most of the glitches I saw were silly and goofy, like you not locking into a save point and seeing two severed arms interacting with it as you save your progress. Something that's a little weird but doesn't really affect your gameplay. And now let's dive into battery life. The original model gets a battery range of 2 hours and 59 up to 3 hours and 55. The Nintendo Switch Lite gets a range of 3 hours and 18 up to 4 hours and 13. The Red Boxer V2 2019 model gets a range of 5 hours and 3 up to 5 hours and 59. And the OLED model gets a range of 5 hours and 26 up to 6 hours and 16. In conclusion, Syndrome is a pretty okay space horror game. It has pretty good sound cues and scares at the beginning, though suffers from a just okay second half, odd and clunky combat, and way too much repetition with the constant backtracking. It's not a bad horror game, but I wouldn't call it good either. Reviews to Go rates Syndrome for the Nintendo Switch a 6 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching and have a great day.